Lear crashed through the forest, heedless of where he was going. Once they reached the foot of those treacherous stairs, Lear and Tonlo had fled in a full panic down the island's rugged flank, desperate to find the beach. Lear had left his sword and the sack of treasure behind on the floor of the temple. He would not pay the bloody price. He did not want to end up as another head on a spike, or gored to death at the bottom of a pit, or feel his skull crushed beneath that bastard's massive hands. Lear wanted to live. The desperation was high in his throat like a hot gorge, bile ready to spill out. He would get off this miserable cursed island. He would burn incense every morning to honor Zol, say 1,000 prayers, never again touch a bottle or a woman. Lear went down. His ankle twisted brutally in a snarled root. He screamed, low like an animal, and felt no shame for it. Tonlo crashed over him an instant later, and Lear only saw the barest flicker of recognition as the red-haired man cast a pitiful look over his shoulder. And then he was gone. Rolling onto his side, Lear lost sight of the world. Pain was bright behind his eyes as he probed gingerly at his ankle. It was caught, possibly broken. The slightest pressure made it feel as if his leg would erupt. He wanted to die now. But he would not. Lear was a survivor. He had survived the warrens of Sukudesh in his youth, had won enough to buy his collar in the slave pits, and freed himself. He had sailed on the bloody wind for near 10 years now, and earned a reputation that he was fiercely proud of. Blown ankle or not, he would escape. Gritting his teeth and clenching his eyes shut, Lear worked his ankle through white-hot pain until his leg came free of the root. Sweat burst from his brow and poured down his neck as he fought to contain a shriek of agony. He compromised on vomiting into the bushes, letting the heaving drain his misery. Then he surveyed the damage. The skin was not torn, but the grinding of bone told him something was probably broken. With shaking hands he began to probe the ground around him until he found a stick that was sturdy enough to hold his weight. He propped himself up and began to hobble, more carefully this time, towards the shore. Each step was agony, but he would get through it. He would make it back to the bloody wind and leave this hellhole behind. So it was that Lear did not meet the same fate as his comrade when he heard Tonlo cry out in alarm, outrage, and pain. Instead, he drew the knife he kept on his belt with his free hand and limped ahead slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground for any more treacherous roots, or worse. When he finally found Tonlo, no particular challenge given the huge whimpering noises the man was making, Lear saw that the smaller man was lying beneath 2 immense fat snakes. They coiled over him, scaly bodies heaped like sinuous death. "Lear!" he cried. "They bite!" Lear nodded, watching on, suppressing his revulsion and horror. "Where did they bite?" "My arm, my leg, all over." "Then you're dead, brother." The other man's face contorted in horrified realization. Already, Lear could see the swelling in the arm and the black corruption spreading up in Tonlo's neck. Only a matter of time now. Lear searched for something to say, some word of comfort or wisdom, but he found none. Exhausted, terrified, and in no small discomfort himself, he simply turned his back on Tonlo and limped for the shore, giving a wide berth to the snakes. The going was slow, torturous, but it forced him to be careful. Lear made it to the sands not long after dawn had begun to warm the horizon, and the sun was coming up high over the eastern waters, dashing everything in vivid pinks and greens. He felt dizzy, almost delirious with relief when he fell to his knees beside the burned-out husks of the boats by the water. The tide had risen, and there was no sign of Lionel's body or his loot. Back to the sea, he thought wearily. The sea always took back what was hers, eventually. Lear heard footsteps behind him. His heart fell into his belly. He turned and saw Ulrim's scowling face. Hard grey eyes bore no regret for the blood shed in the night, and he did not seem worn by his bloody labors. As sleekly muscled as a great cat, the man could have been carved of stone for all he moved. Lear cowered away from him. "Made it back to the beach," Ulrim said. His hateful sword was propped against his shoulder insolently. The ring on his finger glittered in the morning light. "Just do it," Lear said miserably. The fire had gone out of him. The sea called to him now, beckoning him home on white-capped rollers. He could let go, now, Lear realized with some small measure of comfort.
Can't. Need you.
You aren't going to kill me? His heart thudded painfully as hope was rekindled.
Not if I want off this fucking island,
Ulrim spat.
You didn't help them toss me overboard. Think you'll try a second time?
Hells no, Lear said. He wanted to laugh, but the best he could muster was a choking wheeze. Gratitude bubbled up in him as he realized he was not going to die on that cursed strand.
Fine. Here they come with the fourth boat. You wait here and call them in. We'll need a few of them to get back out to the wind.
Aye, Lear said, seeing what the big man was about. Even as they spoke, the fourth boat was dropped into the waves beside the bigger ship. What if I warn them? Ulrim laughed darkly.
You think they can paddle faster than I can swim?
Lear shook his head and swallowed. As you say, then. The fourth boat came on in the tides. Seabirds circled overhead, yelping and screeching as 3 men in ragged tunics and patched breeches jumped over the gunwales and set to work hauling the boat up onto the sands. Lear stood leaning on his crutch, watching. Where the hell's his red ram? Tade! They shouted over the rumbling surf and wind. Dead, Black Lear called back. Same as Fet, Tonlo, all of them. The pirates looked at one another in shock. What are you playing at, Lear? Where's Joel? Before he could answer, a stone struck the nearest man in the temple. Blood splashed across the sand, and the others shouted in horror. The man fell dead, even as the others scrambled back, tugging short knives out of their belts. Sorry, boys, Lear said. Ulrim burst out of the strand of reeds he had been hiding in, roaring like a wild thing. Upon seeing him covered in mud and blood, a revenant of the man they had seen drown 3 days earlier, the crewmen threw down their blades and held up their hands, flinching in terror as he drew up before them, breath heaving and eyes wild. New man in charge, Lear shouted and clapped his hands. I wasn't lying what I said earlier. No use waiting for dead men. Let's head back to the ship. The survivors of the fourth crew paddled back under Ulrim's glaring watch. He was wearing the tunic and headscarf of Tudik, the man he had felled with the stone. The disguise was thin, as Tudik was nowhere near as large as Ulrim, but it would serve. Lear sat at the stern, hands curled protectively over his ankle, trying to keep it from moving with the rocking, unsteady motion of the boat. They drew near enough the rest of the crew, calling questions to them, but none of the boatmen responded. Ulrim's sword, held low so the men aboard the Bloody Wind could not see it, was at their backs. One false move and he would spit them, sure as day. They knocked up against the side of the huge vessel, and Lear felt a moment of tension as thick as the salt in the air. He met the eyes of the oarsmen, who seemed to be teetering on indecision. A raised cry now would warn the men aboard, who were throwing down a ladder, of what fate awaited them. Ulrim seized the ladder and climbed up with impossible cat-like speed. The cry warning in Lear's throat as Ulrim made it to the top, and shouts of violence broke out. The oarsmen were scurrying up the ladder now, eager to get in on whatever action was happening. It was over before they made it to the deck. The captain's body, garbed in a fine silk coat chased with gold lacing, and a huge writhing dragon in silver, crashed into the sea beside the little boat. His head followed a moment later, floating for a moment before sinking below the dark, glassy waves. Lear carefully pulled himself up on the deck, 1 foot at a time, his eyes closed hard against the pain in his ankle. At the top, he found the dozen or so remaining crewmen in a ring around Ulrim. 3 other men were dead or dying on the deck around him. His broadsword had tasted blood yet again, and there was a wicked slice across his chest, where someone had given him a good one. Ulrim snarled, pacing sharply like a lion surrounded by hyenas.
Anyone else want to taste brave blade?
He demanded, shaking the sword at them.
It has a thirst for fools and cowards.
Though blades were drawn, none were raised. Some of the men were breathing heavily, rage barely held in check. By now, word had spread about what had happened on the island. Brothers and comrades slaughtered like pigs in the night. Lear understood the anger, the shock, but he saw clearly that if more were injured or killed, they would hardly have enough hands to limp the Bloody Wind back to a safe harbor. He forced his way through the ring and shook his head at the carnage. Then he said the only thing he could think of. "Captain threw him to the sea, boys, and the sea spit him back at us." This earned a nervous, uneasy laughter. "Captain tried to kill him first," said someone else. "Could have been any one of us, lads." A few blades were tucked away as the looming violence faded. "A man who kills a captain is the captain." "Aye," said Lear. "Any dissenting voices?" The crew looked at one another. Slowly they shook their heads, absorbed in this new arrangement, just as dogs learn to accept a new pack leader. They settled down and drew back a step. One of the deck officers bellowed an order, and men trickled back to their duties. "A dangerous game you played, Captain," Lear said, limping up to Ulrim. They looked out at the island, which, unless Lear's eyes were playing tricks on him, seemed to be drifting away. Had to be the sea, he thought. The waves played strange tricks on a man's eyes, especially when he was tired. And Lear was as tired as the dead. Ulrim had sheathed his sword and was leaning on the rail, watching the island with a curious light in his grey eyes. What it could mean, Lear could not say. "What are your orders?"